In the years following the Civil War, men North and South would gather together as veterans to meet up and reminisce together. Now in the North, they had a veterans organization called the Grand Army of the Republic, or the GAR. And Union men would get together to reminisce about the war, some of the things they'd experienced together. Sometimes they would show up in their old uniform, or maybe they would just come in their suit, the suits that they wore at that time. They might be presented with something like this cockade, which is just a ribbon here that presents that they were a part of the Union Army during the war, part of the fighting as a veteran. Maybe they would wear a regimental pin like this one that would express what regiment they were with, like this 9th Ohio Volunteer Infantry pin. But the main thing is they would gather together and they'd have ceremonies, a lot of patriotic fervor and a lot of patriotic celebrations sort of went along with these organizations. They would even gather together, and sometimes they would sleep in tents on the grounds in a park, and they would even sometimes reenact some of the battles that they had been in. And these kind of meetings were actually the precursor to our modern day Civil War reenactments that maybe you have seen at a park or in a field or something like that. But whether it was North or South, their meetings, and as tensions sort of subsided throughout the years, sometimes it would be both Union veterans and Confederate veterans at the same event. But as they gathered together, one of the biggest questions the common soldier asked of each other was, what did it all mean? What had the war been about? So why does the Civil War come? Well, the short, easy answer, and sort of the final straw, you might say, in the coming of the Civil War is the election of Abraham Lincoln on November the 6th, 1860. And the reason why that was a final straw moment is up to that point, no presidential candidate or political party had made the aggressive sort of policies that they intended to set in place that Lincoln and the Republicans did concerning the issue of slavery. And Lincoln's platform for the election was simply that there would no longer be any states added to the United States that were slave states. See, up to that point, they kind of had a balance of power where if you added a state in the North as a free state, they would add a state in the southern states as a slave state. And so there was a series of compromises there, and Lincoln and the Republicans in this election said that was going to come to an end. And the southern states saw that as a threat to mainly their political power. Obviously, slavery is connected to that, but it's not only slavery, it's the economic things that were associated with it, but it's other policies in the future that they might want to pass, and without that political balance and power, they wouldn't have that ability to do that. And they saw that as an ultimate final threat to what they believed, how they lived, their economic income, things like that. And at that point, starting with South Carolina, they began to secede. They literally formed their own nation, the Confederate States of America. So that's the beginning point. Interesting thing is that Lincoln would have probably never won the election if the Democrat Party had not been split in the 1860 election. They split and actually had two candidates, a northern candidate, Stephen Douglas, and a southern candidate, John Breckinridge. Of course, when we're talking about the Civil War, we simply cannot go without talking about the moral issues and impact related to slavery. It obviously was a big concern and a big problem. And it wasn't just a concern at the point of, or a little bit before the beginning of the Civil War, it actually was an issue even with the founding of the nation and the Constitution. You had a lot of founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson who would often sort of go back and forth in his own mind about the idea of knowing that slavery was immoral, but also knowing or having the fear that eliminating slavery would have a giant economic impact on his life and who he was as an agriculturalist. A lot of the founding fathers, they felt that eventually slavery would die out as the nation became more industrialized. We're going to talk in a moment how actually the opposite became true with that, economically speaking. But to appease the southern colonies and to make sure that the Constitution was ratified and for their own economic benefit, many of the founding fathers decided to sort of overlook or forego the slavery issue in the hopes of it dying out on its own later. And as we know, that didn't happen. So about 1830 is when the real abolitionist movement, that morality sort of issue, becomes really a big factor in the coming of the Civil War. And you had some factors come together that were very influential. Number one was the Great Awakening, which was a Christian movement that took off in the United States at that time, that drew a lot of people toward thinking on moral issues a lot more. And slavery became one of those issues that a lot of the Christian churches in the North would think about, and abolition becoming a part of that focus and factor in sort of ramping up this moral talk about the Civil War. Also, you start to have some very intellectual, smart, good at marketing, you might say, people who start to rise in the North and New England, people like William Lloyd Garrison, a lady in the South who had come up, who had been a part of a slave-owning family, Sarah Grimke. She comes up to New England and becomes a part of that sort of organization that begins to really put out information that's related to the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement, and becomes sort of this catalyst for beginning to question the institution of slavery heavily. Of course, Frederick Douglass becomes a big part of that when he runs away from the South. He writes a biography of his life as a slave. He becomes a great public speaker. And all these things begin to cause these issues, or not issues, but tensions North and South. And even though in the North, the abolitionist movement was a very small movement, they were a very vocal movement, and they started to gather the attention of politicians in the North who, either because it was the thing they could latch onto to get more votes, or because they themselves believed in the cause of ending slavery for moral issues, they began to promote this idea of ending slavery in Washington, in Congress. Of course, we can't leave out the economic impact that slavery had. You know, if slavery doesn't make money for the South, and it had some residual impact, economically speaking, on the North and Europe, slavery doesn't exist. It would die out just like the Founding Fathers believed it would. Especially in the area of cotton. In 1792, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. Slaves could go from merely picking and filtering down and picking down the fibers from the seeds, what would take them hours to basically get a pound of lint done. They, as a group of slaves, could do thousands of pounds in a single day. And because of that, and then other things that were starting to happen that would help to make slavery pay, slavery really becomes a major industry. And again, anytime you have something that makes money, sadly, the moralities of the issues aren't always the concern of the people who are involved in that when it comes to sort of their feelings on things like inequality and slavery and things like that. And so it becomes a big economic impact. Now, obviously some in the South, they were unwilling to let go of it because it was making millions of dollars for them every year, and so maybe greed is a factor. For some people, it's just a matter of trying to live and survive because in an era like this, even though we know slavery is wrong, if you try to threaten the economic impact of a family, maybe it's as simple as a small farmer who doesn't own any slaves, but he has a hard time getting his crop in on his own, so he hires out a couple of slaves or rents them to help out at crop time. He needs them, not because he's some rich plantation owner, but because he's trying to feed his family and take care of his family. And again, I know that's still going to sound inexcusable, and you'd be right. But it is a factor, this idea of I need to try to make money, I need to take care of my family, and if slavery is a part of that, it's going to be really hard to let go of that, okay? Now, to give you an indication of how big slavery was, in sale of slaves alone in 1860, slavery as a sale of just the persons themselves, the slaves themselves, it's a $3 billion industry. That's $75 billion in our money today. And at that time, there was all the industries like railroads and things like that combined didn't top that $3 billion income. And so you kind of get an idea of why it would be difficult to let go of that. And again, not that it excuses slavery at all, but it kind of helps you understand why this war comes. One thing that doesn't get mentioned a lot when we discuss the Civil War is the impact that the media had on the division between the North and the South. At that time, most people, the media or the news and the newspapers they could get only told their side of the story. And so if you live in the South, say South Carolina and Charleston as an example, all you're getting is Charleston and South Carolina's point of view, which is going to be a pro-Southern point of view. In the North, it's the same way. The newspapers that would come out in the North would promote their point of view. And so a lot of the division comes not only because you couldn't get different points of view and sort of formulate an overall opinion of the issues and the divisions between North and South, but as you know, just like today in our media, oftentimes the newspapermen would inflame the division because that's what sells newspapers. Also, people didn't travel as much. Today, we know that people we have conflict with, when we study it and get down to it and meet them and see their culture, we know they're not as bad as some newspaper outlets make them out to be. Back then, people didn't travel, and so if all they had was word of mouth, newspapers telling them about how bad the other side was, well, that's going to be a big factor in causing a lot of conflict and issues between North and South. Now, connected to slavery, and to some degrees based on interpretation aside from slavery, for the South, there were some disagreements they had with the United States government related to constitutional interpretation. Okay, there are some things in the Constitution that are not always that clear, or they were clear in a way that even promoted slavery, such as the ideas related to property rights. And even though they were a human being, and we today see that and know that is wrong, they would have seen that as their property, and the Constitution protected that. They also felt that the Constitution didn't tell them that when they decided they had had enough of the United States and its policies, that they couldn't secede and leave and form their own country. And so a lot of what caused the Civil War is related to constitutional interpretation, about property, about if they could secede and form their own nation or not. States' rights was also a very big issue. That's an issue related to, could the states decide themselves as a governing body on their own whether or not they wanted to have slaves or any law that they might establish and want to have? Or does the federal government have the right to dictate those laws? That's a struggle we've struggled with from the beginning of our country all the way up to today when it comes to states' rights. In the end, I just want to point out that this will be about a 10-minute video. The volumes of information written about the Civil War, the things that we simply can't cover because of time. I know that if you're someone who's educated on the Civil War, you'll watch this video and you'll say, he forgot to mention that, or he could have mentioned this fact here, and you'd be right. There's just too much to try to cover in such a small, short bit of time. But I hope the video has been beneficial for you, especially those of you who are students. In the end, the Civil War had to happen because it had to fix the things that were not taken care of when the nation was founded at the very first. That is defining the fact that because the Constitution said all men are created equal, that meaning all people were created equal, that had to be decided, and slavery was a very big issue and part of that. But also defining what the nation was going to become. Would it become a nation of just separated nation states, or would it become a unified nation? A United States of America, unified collectively together with one mission for its people.